I'm Matt Brown, and you're listening to the Matt Brown Podcast. I think we've got a great show for you today. You'll likely know that London City Council gave itself a hefty wage increase, and it will go into effect just over a year from today. It was a close vote. 6 councillors voted against this move, and 3 changed their vote to nay during the final debate. As we head into an election, is this one of the first bona fide citywide issues that will enter into the debates? The majority of sitting council members have already declared that they'll be running to protect their seat. Where it gets interesting is incumbents largely run on their voting records on big issues, while challengers can both bring new ideas forward and at the same time be critical of decisions their opponents, the incumbents, made during the past term of council. Will challengers latch on to issues like the record-setting cumulative 26% tax increase this current city council approved over the course of their 4-year multi-year budget, while at the same time giving London City Council members a task force recommended 35% raise? These were both bold political moves, so possibly so. We'll have to stay tuned. Today, we're lucky to have the chair of the Council Resourcing Review Task Force here with us to tell us about the process they followed and the reasons behind making the recommendations that they did. He's joining us in a minute, so let's go.
Discover London Bicycle Cafe.
Cozy up with a daily soup and sandwich or unwind with an evening latte and some Dutch comfort food.
London Bicycle Cafe at the Forks of the Thames. See you soon.
London City Council approved an over 35% base increase for themselves that will be implemented just over a year from today. Councillors' overall budget for salary and expenses could go from $5.2 million to almost $7.7 million. That's an almost 50% increase. And this number does not include the cost of the city staff who support them. Today, a London City Councillor makes about $67,500 per year. The mayor makes $163,000 and change. And depending on their role, and based on the numbers available to me, some of which were pretty hard to find, beginning in 2027, a councillor will be making $94,000. And in 2030, at the end of the term, it could be $104,000. The mayor could be making just shy of $181,000 at that time too. It's an age-old story. Councils in Ontario have had to decide their own wages, and London is no exception. The past few councils have dealt with this by striking a task force made up with community members who review the job, review what other communities are paying their councils, and then they make recommendations for council to consider. And councils typically make adjustments for the following term. Even with this once removed process, the final decision remains with council. And to say the debate is awkward is an understatement. I used to call this the third rail of municipal politics. It's like being between a rock and a hard place while living in a fishbowl. And ironically, every member of council takes an oath of office at the beginning of their term. They promise to declare any fiduciary conflict, and they have to abstain from any vote that could benefit them monetarily, except for deciding their own pay. For the current council, this process unfolded over the past year and culminated in a pretty big raise that just a few weeks ago, based on the task force recommendations, they've granted an initial 35% raise, and they're also considering an increase to their expense budget from $13,500 per year to $25,000 per year, largely to contract staff to help them with constituent work. That option has been referred to a council committee for review and will be decided in the months to come. Some will say that in the grand scheme of the city's billion-dollar operating budget, this is not an issue. Others have questioned the decision within the context of recent funding cuts council has made to some programs, some of which support London's most vulnerable people, all in the name of keeping taxes more affordable. The vote for an increase was a close one, with 6 councillors opposed. So this decision might be the first citywide election issue presenting itself. It's a story that likely has long legs, long enough to stick around through to the next election. And that's the background. Let's get on with the show. Today we have the Council Compensation Task Force Chair, Dr. Martin Horak, an expert in urban politics and a professor at Western University. He's here with us today to tell us all about it. Dr. Martin Horak, welcome to the show.
All right. Well, it's great to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
We're lucky to have you with us. So first off, tell us a little bit about the work of the Compensation Task Force.
Okay, yeah. So officially we were called the Council Resourcing Review Task Force, and that's because we had a slightly bigger mandate or broader mandate than previous task forces. This isn't the first time this has been done, right?
No, that's true.
Every 4 years, a task force is set up to review council compensation and resourcing, because it makes it a little less awkward for councillors to have, the legitimacy of an independent recommendation to work with. And so there are 5 of us on the task force, and we got a relatively broad mandate. We were asked to look at council compensation, but also at other elements of resourcing like staffing, staff support. And we were asked to comment on, defining the role of a councillor here in London, right? So those are all things that were in the mix. There were 5 of us. And we had a series of 7 meetings. Each meeting was about 3 hours long. We worked from February until September to produce our recommendations. And we did a number of things. Primarily, we did a bunch of research. Right? So we surveyed our councillors about how much they work, what they do their work on, what their own expectations of the role are. And we surveyed the public. We got almost 400 responses. So that's pretty decent, a pretty good cross-section of folks. And from them, from the public, we heard that the public expect councillors to be full-time. It was about 70% of the public said, yes, this is a full-time job.
Okay, and now that's interesting. The full-time work is very interesting because the Municipal Act doesn't allow for that. This is a council stipend for providing, basically fulfilling your civic duty. And so how did you get around that little conundrum?
So it's tricky, right? Yes, you're absolutely right. The Municipal Act basically doesn't define it as a full-time or part-time job because it doesn't define it as a job, right? It defines it as a service, right? And so we in the task force ultimately talk about it in our report as a full-time service. And we do this but not because we can specify hours. We're not allowed to specify hours. It's just not how it works, right? It takes the hours that it takes. But what we found from our councillor survey and from our survey of the public is that it takes 45 or 50 or 55 hours a week to do this job well, and that's also what the public expect. Right, and so ultimately we defined this as a full-time service without specific hours, but as something that clearly people expect when councillors get elected, that councillors make it their number one priority. Right?
Well, fair enough. And councils they work impossibly hard, right? You look at councillors and they're busy during the week, often in meetings. They're busy in the evenings, often at events. And they're busy on the weekends, often at neighborhood events.
Sure,
I think the average in the report, councillors reported working a 51-hour week, which is a significant amount of time. Yeah. And some, of course, the way averages worked a lot harder than that. I used to say to the councillors that were on the council that I served as mayor that you are going to choose to work as hard as you want to. There's always going to be more work out there. They could work for 70 hours. They could work for 80 hours. We'd worry about their health. How did you arrive at the idea that this is going to be full-time work? And is there a mechanism that's in place that could ensure that that's happening? I mean, I understand it's the expectation of the community. We want full-time councillors. The Municipal Act doesn't support that. What could London City Council do if, for example, there was a councillor not pulling their weight next year?
Yeah. Well, and we actually do know that in the current council, there's folks who work a lot more than others, right? And so it is tricky because you can't legislate a minimum number of hours. It's just not allowed. Right. However, you can do other things, right? And so what we did in our report, and we came to this after significant discussion about how to do this, is we proposed to council, and they've now accepted, that they're going to adopt language in various council documents to really codify and write down this idea that this is a full-time equivalent service, that councillors who get elected should not be spending time on other careers or occupations, that they should devote their time to this. And so there's various ways in which that's going to be embedded in council documents, such as the the councillor role description, council code of conduct potentially. And then we also recommended some more specific things. So for example, there are, I believe, 47 agency board and commission posts out there that have to
somewhere
be
between 45 and 50, right?
Yeah, have to be staffed by council members. There's 15 council members. So if you do the math, that's at least 3 each. But right now, that's not how it works. Some councillors are on a whole bunch, and some councillors really aren't on any. Right? And so we've recommended that council bind itself to have each council member work on at least 3 ABCs. So there was a series of recommendations that we put together to try to essentially level that workload a little bit more, because we know that, it's diverse. And at the same time, because ultimately you can't, there's no mechanism to say, okay, you haven't worked enough and we're going to fire you except for the election. That's what the election is for, right?
Well, no, that's
after
true.
4 years, the election comes, and if folks feel like their councillor hasn't worked hard enough for them, they're going to let them know.
No, that's true. And, I used to say that it's a really tough job interview for a job that you probably won't get. You work for months and months and months. And then after serving for 4 years, well, you're up for review. And that's a tough process as well. I suppose the other mechanism that could be used if it's in the code of conduct is that perhaps the integrity commissioner could play a role. If a councillor is stepping outside of following the code of conduct, then a complaint could be made and there could be an integrity commissioner investigation. They have certain tools that are available to them to...
it's true. That whole question actually is going to need to get resolved in the next year or so, though, because as you might know, the province is now in the process of developing new legislation that kind of centralizes this whole integrity commissioner thing, right? So what we recommended to council actually is that it propose some language to the province that would be appropriate for large municipalities that recognizes the full-time equivalent nature of the role.
Okay, well, this is kind of
so
like
we'll see where that goes.
Of course,
right?
yeah. It's like a Wayne Gretzky, you got to skate to where the puck is going. And so maybe that language will be implemented and embedded in the province-wide code of conduct.
I mean, that's not done yet.
Right.
But that's that's a thing that's in process.
Yeah. Okay. So you touched on the boards and commissions, and people probably at home are surprised to hear that there are so many positions for council to sit on, and it takes a lot of time.
And some of them are a lot more work than others, I will say.
Right. There's the London Police Service Board. That's a big
huge.
one. It takes a lot of work. London Library takes a lot of work. London Transit Commission. Those all, and the health unit as well. And then there are some smaller ones. Museum London, for example, which they do important work, and I'm sure that the councillors supporting that work are putting the appropriate amount of time into.
Yeah, and we did kind of discuss, do we want to go more fine-grained in our recommendations? And I think some councillors would have been happy if we'd recommended, different tiers of board and agency service. But you start splitting hairs a little bit, and ultimately we as a task force felt, okay, if council's going to do that, it's probably council's job to figure that out. Right?
Yeah, and not only that, when you start attaching value to appointments, then it can become very competitive, and it can have a negative unintended consequence on the way that council works together. So I wanted to talk about one other number. So there's 15 members of council, which is a pretty big council for a community this size. You looked at compensation and down to an average wage that you felt was sort of appropriate. Did you look at the compositions of council? So, for example, Toronto, 24 members of council, 6 times larger than London. Did you consider, what if council reduced its size to 9 or 11, used their existing budgets to provide the increases that you felt were appropriate?
Well, we briefly talked about it, but we were told that was not in our mandate to figure that out. Because there is a separate process for reviewing ward boundaries and so on, right? Which just recently happened, right? So
it takes about 2 years to review the ward boundaries.
But we did make a recommendation that those things should be linked next time around, right? Because absolutely. If you're thinking of council compensation and resourcing, it's always in relation to how many constituents each councillor is serving, right? In London, it's, I believe, and don't quote me on this, well, people might, but it's around 32,000 people per ward councillor at this point in time, right? So that's pretty comparable to other municipalities that are similar in size, but obviously it's not like in Toronto, where there's 24 member of council serving almost 3 million people. It's like 120,000 people per ward, right?
Right.
So that does matter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It speaks to workload and all kinds of other things. So the issues are logically linked. They should be logically linked. And so we told council in our report, you guys should be considering these two things together going forward, right?
Yeah,
But we weren't mandated for that.
For
so we
sure.
didn't
And
talk about it.
stay tuned for that one. It's always difficult for a council to say, especially if they're considering running the next election, let's reduce the number of seats. Councillor Rahman, who voted against the main motion, has an HR background and makes a really interesting argument, one that I hadn't thought of, about strong mayor powers.
Right.
And so what her argument, one of them, is that the councillor now has fewer decision-making responsibilities because the mayor is really setting the budget. They can make amendments, he can veto. It's a lot more complicated. Did you consider that at that granular level? The job is actually less intense than it would have been before strong mayor powers.
Yeah, we did talk about that a little bit. Here I probably give more my personal opinion than my recollection of our conversation, although I think it more or less aligns. But I would say that the fact that we have strong mayor powers now doesn't make council less important. Because council still is the check and balance on any mayoral use of strong mayor powers. There's still a really important role for council to be playing, and it's a different role, but it's not a less important role, right?
Yeah. I just want to thank you very much for coming on the show. Thanks also to you and the task force for the work that you did to get us to this point. And now I think we'll just stay tuned and see what happens next.
Absolutely. So it's been a pleasure to be on here. Do we have about 30 seconds more?
Sure, take it.
Okay. I'll say, because we didn't really talk about the fact that explicitly about the fact that we recommended a very significant increase, right? And there's been a lot of pushback about that. But I just wanted to say that I think there's some really strong reasoning behind that. Councillors are not just representatives of the public, but they are stewarding a $1.4 billion corporation. That's the annual budget, right? Mm-hmm. Think of how much people make in the private sector in corporations that are worth $1.4 billion a year in revenues, right? It's not a direct comparison, but we need to be attracting and retaining really strong, qualified people for a difficult job like that. And that's a big part of the rationale.
Well, I'm glad you got that last point in. Yeah. Now we really are out of time.
All right.
Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And we'll be back to close out the show right after this.
Discover London Bicycle Cafe.
Cozy up with a daily soup and sandwich or unwind with an evening latte and some Dutch comfort food.
London Bicycle Cafe at the Forks of the Thames. See you soon.
Well, that's the show. And like always, I hope you know a little bit more about council salaries in this case and budgets than you did off the top. I said it during the interview and I'll say it again. Most councillors work impossibly hard. Essentially, as a city councillor, you can be as busy as you choose to be. There's always more to do. They worked hard to get elected too. It's a months-long job interview process. It's full of intensity, and there's an equally long performance appraisal every 4 years called the next election. I'm not here to say the numbers we were discussing are too high or too low. That's not my place. I did this episode because it's a big change, and that means it's worth talking about. The decision, though, was this current city council's call. They took on that responsibility when they were elected. And ultimately, the voters will decide if it was the right or wrong call come election time, which is about 11 months from today. You might be wondering if your councillor voted yay or nay on this issue. Well, I can tell you that councillors Susan Stevenson, Sam Trozow, Corinne Rahman, Anna Hopkins, Paul Van Meerbergen, and David Ferreira all voted nay. The other 8 sitting councillors voted in favor of the increase, along with the current mayor. So as we enter into 2026, I expect there's going to be more talk about the election out there in the community. As you know, this show is about all things local, which means that it's likely to come up more and more often over the next 11 months here too. Last local election, the voter turnout rate was dismally low, under 25%, which was reported as a record low. I can tell you it's about half the turnout London was seeing a decade ago. Maybe, if the citizens of London, you and me, pay a little more attention, if we talk to our friends and we talk to our neighbors about it, maybe more Londoners will be engaged and that percentage will go up for 2026 and beyond. An engaged electorate is never a bad thing. And here's my promise to you. I'll never try to influence your vote. You wouldn't like it, and it's not the purpose of this podcast anyway. My goal is to always ensure that you, the listener, know a little bit more about a local topic than you did before you tuned in. After all, information is power, and you deserve as much as you can get from as many sources as you can get it from. And like I always say, this show is for you. In fact, I couldn't do it without you. Please keep sending those questions and episode ideas in. Maybe you're thinking about running for a council seat and you have some ideas to share. Or maybe you're a sitting member of council. I'd love to hear from you in the months to come. Possibly have you on a future show too. If you've tuned in before, you'll know that these are long-form conversations that give us a chance to dig a little deeper into a topic. My goal is to ensure that every conversation we have on this platform will be fair and based on the facts at hand. That goes for any and every one of our guests. And hey, if you hear one side of an issue and feel you want to share your perspective about it from the other side, drop me a line. We'll find the time to make sure that that perspective is voiced and heard as well. For example, Councillor Rahman had a chance to come on and share her views about this topic. If you voted in favor of the increase and you want to explain why, we'll make it happen. Many thanks to Dr. Martin Horak for joining us. And as always, thanks to you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please tell your friends, tell your family. You can also subscribe wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't visited the show website, I invite you to do so. The address is themattbrownpodcast.com. You can drop me a line there, or you can send me an email at themattbrownpodcast@gmail.com. Well, that's the show. I'm Matt Brown, and you're listening to the Matt Brown Podcast. Thanks for that. Bye for now, and talk to you again soon, London.